By December 21, 1944, the trap had closed with mechanical precision. All 7 highways leading into Bastogne, the vital arteries that made this obscure Belgian crossroads worth fighting for, were now firmly in German hands. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division held the eastern approaches. The 2nd Panzer Division controlled the northwest. Panzerlehr blocked the south. Every road, every path, every frozen trail that might have offered escape was sealed. Inside the shrinking perimeter, approximately 22,000 American soldiers faced a mathematics problem with no solution. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had arrived barely 4 hours before the German encirclement closed, racing through the night from rest positions in Reims, France. They'd been promised a quiet sector. Instead, they inherited hell. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division fought alongside them, their Shermans positioned at critical crossroads. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion dug in their M18 Hellcats wherever the perimeter looked weakest. Artillery crews from the 463rd and 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalions rationed every shell, knowing resupply wasn't coming. They were outnumbered 5-1. And they knew it. The cold was the first enemy. Temperatures plunged to 10 degrees, then lower. Paratroopers who jumped into Normandy wearing summer uniforms now huddled in foxholes, wearing whatever they could scavenge. German overcoats stripped from corpses, blankets torn into makeshift scarves, newspapers stuffed inside boots for insulation that lasted maybe an hour before the dampness crept through. Ammunition was the second. Artillery crews received strict orders: 5 rounds per day, maximum unless facing a major assault. Riflemen shared magazines. Bazooka teams hoarded their rockets like gold, knowing each shot might mean the difference between stopping a panzer or watching it roll through their lines. Food was the third. K rations were cut to half portions, then thirds. Medics melted snow for drinking water in helmets held over flickering candles. The lucky ones found abandoned civilian cellars with forgotten jars of preserves. The unlucky ones learned that hunger gnaws harder than fear. Medical supplies were running out. Plasma reserves dwindled to almost nothing. Morphine was reserved only for the worst cases, and there were too many worst cases. Surgeons operated by candlelight in the cellars of destroyed buildings, amputating frostbitten limbs without anesthesia, while artillery shook dust from the rafters overhead. But the worst enemy was the fog. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. For 6 days, dense winter fog smothered the Ardennes like a burial shroud, grounding all Allied aircraft. No supply drops, no air support, no reconnaissance, no hope arriving from above. The 101st could hear German armor repositioning in the mist, could hear their enemy growing stronger while they grew weaker. But they couldn't see more than 50 yards in any direction. The fog erased the sky, and with it, erased the one advantage that might have saved them. From their siege positions, German commanders waited with cold patience. Time, weather, and attrition were doing their work. Bastogne would fall. It was inevitable. Until the morning of December 23rd, when the fog finally began to lift. The bombardment began at dawn on December 22nd, not with the massive barrages that had opened the offensive, but with something more calculated, more cruel. German artillery crews had learned the rhythm of the American defenses. They knew where the aid stations were hidden, where supply dumps clustered near the crossroads, where exhausted paratroopers tried to sleep in shallow foxholes between shifts. The shells came in sporadic waves, 15 minutes of thunderous fire, then silence, Then another burst when defenders tried to move. Psychological warfare mixed with high explosives. 105mm and 150mm rounds crashed into Bastogne's town center with methodical precision. Buildings that had survived centuries collapsed in seconds. The Baroque church of Saint-Pierre, where civilians had sheltered since the siege began, took a direct hit during evening prayers. Medics dug through rubble by flashlight, pulling out the wounded and the dead while more shells screamed overhead. The civilian population suffered alongside the soldiers. Roughly 3,000 Belgian residents remained trapped inside the perimeter. Their town transformed into an abattoir. Families huddled in basements that became tombs when artillery collapsed the structures above them. Children cried from hunger that their parents couldn't satisfy. The elderly froze in unheated cellars, their bodies discovered only when the shelling paused long enough for someone to check. At the makeshift aid station in the Heinz barracks, Captain Jack Pryor and his medical staff worked miracles with disappearing resources. The morphine ran out first, then the plasma, then the sulfa powder for infections. Surgeons operated on kitchen tables with instruments sterilized in boiling snow water, amputating limbs by candlelight while men screamed and bit down on leather belts. "I need morphine for this man," a medic pleaded, holding pressure on a paratrooper's shredded leg. Pryor shook his head, his hands already deep in another soldier's chest cavity. "We're out. Give him whiskey if we have any left. Otherwise, just talk to him." The medic stayed beside the wounded paratrooper, whispering reassurances that neither of them believed, while the man's screams dissolved into whimpering and finally, mercifully, unconsciousness. Food rations reached catastrophic levels. Quartermasters distributed what remained with brutal arithmetic. 1K ration split between 3 men per day. Artillery crews received slightly more, knowing they needed strength to manhandle the guns. Everyone else learned to ignore the gnawing emptiness, to focus on anything except the hunger that made their hands shake and their vision blur. Some units slaughtered horses killed by shellfire, roasting the meat over small fires that drew immediate German mortar attention. Others raided abandoned homes for forgotten cans of vegetables, jars of jam, anything edible. A single can of sardines became currency worth a week's pay. Still, the men held. Not because they believed relief was coming. Most had stopped believing that. Not because they thought they could win. The mathematics were too clear. They held because the alternative was surrender. And surrender meant admitting the wolves circling in the snow had finally broken them. German loudspeakers crackled through the fog each evening. "Americans, you are surrounded. Lay down your weapons. You will be treated well." The 101st's answer remained the same. Rifle fire aimed at the speakers. December 22nd, 11:30 hours. 4 German soldiers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried an ultimatum typed on official Wehrmacht stationery, signed by General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps. The message was delivered to the command post where Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne in the absence of Major General Maxwell Taylor, read it with growing incredulity. The German demand was formal, almost polite in its certainty. To the USA, commander of the encircled town of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. This time, the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The ultimatum gave them 2 hours to respond. Refusal would result in complete destruction. McAuliffe read it twice, then looked up at his staff officers. Someone asked what he thought they should reply. His response was immediate, instinctive, and would become the most famous single word of the Battle of the Bulge. "Aw, nuts!" The room fell silent. Then someone, Accounts vary who suggested that might actually be the perfect official response. McAuliffe considered it for a moment, then grabbed a pencil and piece of paper. He wrote 4 lines. To the German commander, nuts, the American commander. When the German officers returned for the American answer, Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry handed them the typed reply. The Germans stared at it, confused. "What does this mean?" one asked in careful English. "Is this affirmative or negative?" Harper didn't hesitate. "It means, go to hell." Then, leaning closer, "And if you continue this foolish attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." The German officers departed in stiff silence. Within the American perimeter, news of McAuliffe's response spread like wildfire through the foxholes and aid stations and artillery positions. Men who'd been rationing ammunition and sharing half-frozen K rations suddenly stood a little straighter. The word wasn't just defiance, it was identity. It said, "We know we're surrounded. We know we're outnumbered. We know you think we're finished. And we don't care." That night, the 101st braced for the annihilation promised in the German ultimatum. Artillery crews stacked their remaining shells within arm's reach. Bazooka teams positioned themselves at likely armor approaches. Riflemen fixed bayonets and checked their grenades. Aid station staff prepared for mass casualties. They had no supplies to treat. The attack would come. They all knew it. The Germans would throw everything at them now. Armor, artillery, infantry, in overwhelming numbers. The mathematics hadn't changed. The odds were still impossible. But something else had changed. The 101st had drawn a line not in the snow, but in the soul. They would not surrender. They would not break. And if the Germans wanted Bastogne, they would pay for every frozen inch of it in blood. The fog still smothered the sky. Relief still seemed impossible. But the screaming eagles had sent their answer to the wolves. Nuts! The fog came like an occupying force. For 6 consecutive days, December 17th through December 22nd, dense winter mist blanketed the Ardennes with such suffocating completeness that visibility dropped to 50 yards, sometimes less. Paratroopers in forward positions couldn't see their own perimeter. Artillery observers couldn't spot targets. Tank commanders navigated by compass and prayer, terrified of driving into German positions hidden 20 feet away. But the real catastrophe was above. Every Allied aircraft in Europe sat grounded. The Aix Troop Carrier Command at bases across England and France watched the weather reports with growing desperation. C-47 transport pilots volunteered for suicide runs through the fog, willing to risk flying blind if it meant getting supplies to Bastogne. Their commanders refused. Flying in zero visibility meant flying into mountains, into each other, into oblivion. The fog had erected an impenetrable ceiling between the trapped garrison and salvation. The psychological impact was devastating. American soldiers in foxholes stared upward at the gray void where their air superiority should have been. For months they'd grown accustomed to Allied dominance overhead, P-47 Thunderbolts appearing within minutes of a radio call, B-17s darkening the sky en route to German cities, the constant reassuring drone of Allied engines. Air power had become their birthright, their guarantee of survival. Now the sky was empty, silent, hostile. The wounded suffered worst. Men hit by shrapnel or frostbite lay in foxholes slowly freezing to death because moving them meant exposing them to German fire. Medics crawled through the fog to reach casualties, often discovering they'd arrived too late. The cold had done what the wounds hadn't finished. Bodies stiffened in the positions where they'd fallen, becoming frozen monuments to weather as deadly as artillery. Private First Class Robert Bowen, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, later recalled, You'd hear a guy calling for a medic somewhere in the fog, but you couldn't tell if he was 10 yards away or 100. By the time you found him, he'd stopped calling. The cold just took them. Morale began its slow erosion. Not collapse. The 101st was too professional, too proud for that, but a gradual wearing away of hope, like water against stone. Men stopped talking about when relief would arrive and started talking about if. The defiant energy that had followed McAuliffe's "nuts" response began fading into grim resignation. German propaganda exploited the weather with calculated cruelty. Their loudspeakers broadcast through the fog each evening. "Americans, where is your Air Force now? Where are your supplies? Your commanders have abandoned you to freeze and starve. Surrender and you will be warm tonight." Some nights, the cold made the lies almost believable. Artillery crews huddled around their guns, burning precious ammunition crates for warmth. Infantry rotated through foxholes every 30 minutes because longer shifts meant frostbite. Tank crews slept inside their vehicles with engines running, knowing each hour of warmth consumed fuel they couldn't replace. And still the fog remained. Impenetrable, immovable, indifferent to courage or desperation. The Germans didn't need to attack. The weather was killing the 101st for them. But on the morning of December 23rd, something changed. A slight brightening in the eastern sky. A thinning of the gray veil. Veterans looked up with cautious, almost fearful hope. The fog was finally lifting. December 23, 1944. 09:15 hours. The change came so gradually that at first no one trusted it. A paratrooper in a foxhole near the eastern perimeter noticed he could see the tree line. Not just vague shapes in the mist, but actual individual pines standing stark against lighter gray. He blinked, rubbed his eyes with frozen fingers, looked again. Still there, clearer now. "Hey," he whispered to the man beside him, "you seeing this?" By 10 o'clock hours, the transformation was undeniable. The suffocating fog that had imprisoned Bastogne for 6 days was dissolving like a curse being lifted. Patches of blue appeared overhead, tentative at first, then widening. Sunlight, actual winter sunlight, began breaking through in shafts that illuminated the snow-covered battlefield with almost painful brilliance. Men emerged from foxholes and cellars, squinting upward like prisoners released from dungeons. Some laughed, others wept. Most simply stood in stunned silence, faces turned toward a sky they'd begun to believe they'd never see again. At the command post, the transformation was immediate. Radio operators who'd been staring at silent equipment for days suddenly had contact with IX Troop Carrier Command. Weather reconnaissance planes confirmed what everyone could now see with their own eyes. The front was clearing from east to west. Flying conditions, marginal but improving. Visibility, sufficient for operations. General McAuliffe grabbed the radio handset himself. "Can you get us supplies today?" The response crackled back through static. "We're loading the birds now, General. Everything we've got." 11:45 hours. The first soldier heard it before he saw anything. A low, rhythmic thrumming carried on the cold air. He frowned, tilted his head, trying to identify the sound. Not artillery, not armor, something different. Then another man heard it, then a dozen, then hundreds. Paratroopers climbed out of their positions, standing exposed, despite sniper threats, straining to locate the source. The sound was growing louder now, resolving from indistinct vibration into something unmistakable. Aircraft engines. Lots of them. Coming from the west. A lieutenant raised his binoculars, scanning the horizon. At first, he saw nothing but empty sky and scattered clouds. Then, there, a dark speck. Then another, then dozens more, growing larger by the second. His hands began trembling, not from cold, but from something he couldn't quite name. "Contact!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Aircraft inbound! Multiple contacts!" Men grabbed whatever they could use as spotting equipment. Binoculars, rifle scopes, even shaving mirrors held up to reflect the sky. The humming had become a roar now, deep and powerful and getting closer. The sound rolled across the frozen battlefield like thunder, like salvation, like the voice of an industrial god announcing its arrival. And then someone, accounts vary, who saw them clearly for the first time and understood the magnitude of what was coming. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, "it's not a squadron. It's an armada." The sky over Bastogne was about to open. 12:07 hours. December 23, 1944. They came in waves that defied comprehension. 241 aircraft, C-47 Skytrains, P-47 Thunderbolts, CG-4A gliders, filled the winter sky over Bastogne in the largest single aerial resupply operation of the entire European theater. Not scattered elements flying desperate solo missions, but a perfectly coordinated armada demonstrating air superiority so absolute it seemed to rewrite the rules of modern warfare. The C-47 transports flew in tight formations at 400 feet, dangerously low, suicidally low, their engines shaking the few remaining windows in Bastogne's shattered buildings. Crews had volunteered for this mission knowing the risks. Every anti-aircraft gun in the German siege ring would be aimed at them. And at that altitude, there was nowhere to hide, no room for evasive maneuvers. They flew straight and level anyway, their bellies packed with supplies that meant the difference between survival and surrender. Inside the town, paratroopers reacted with something between laughter and tears. Men who hadn't smiled in days grabbed each other, pointing skyward, shouting over the engine roar. Some fell to their knees. Others fired their rifles in the air, precious ammunition spent in pure jubilation. Aid station staff rushed outside, wounded men hobbling behind them, everyone desperate to witness what seemed impossible. "They came," a sergeant kept repeating, his voice hoarse. "They actually came." But the Germans weren't surrendering the sky without a fight. Flak batteries erupted from concealed positions around the perimeter, 37 mm, 88 mm, and 20 mm anti-aircraft guns, opening fire in a desperate attempt to break up the formations. Tracers arced upward like deadly fireworks. 2 C-47s took hits almost immediately, one trailing smoke from its starboard engine, the other shuddering as shells punched through its fuselage. Both pilots held formation, completed their drops, then banked away, trailing flame and prayers. That's when the P-47 Thunderbolts arrived. Republic P-47 fighters. Massive, brutal 7-ton machines built around 2,000 horsepower engines and 8 50-caliber machine guns, dove from 8,000 feet with the singular purpose of destroying every anti-aircraft position they could find. Their attack runs were textbook. Steep dives at 400 miles per hour, guns hammering, pulling up just above the tree line while German flak crews scrambled for cover or died at their posts. Lieutenant Colonel Joel Crouch led his fighter squadron in repeated strafing passes, his 50 cals chewing apart a German 88 mm battery that had been pounding Bastogne for days. Tracers converged on gun positions, ammunition dumps, anything that could threaten the transports. The P-47s owned the battlefield, and they wanted everyone, American and German, to know it. A German Oberleutnant from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division watched through binoculars, his face ashen. He'd fought in Russia, in France, in North Africa. He'd seen Luftwaffe formations darken the sky over Warsaw and Rotterdam. But this casual demonstration of industrial might, this armada appearing over a single besieged town as if it were routine, exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had accomplished even at the height of Nazi power. He lowered his binoculars slowly. the mathematical certainty of defeat crystallizing in his mind. The Americans didn't just have air superiority. They had air dominance, and Bastogne was being reborn beneath it. They fell like colored rain. Red parachutes for ammunition, blue for medical supplies, yellow for food, white for miscellaneous cargo, green for communications equipment. Thousands of them blossoming against the winter sky, drifting down over Bastogne in a cascade that transformed desperation into hope in the span of heartbeats. The first bundles hit the ground at 12:15 hours. Paratroopers who moments earlier had been rationing single rifle magazines now sprinted across open ground, German snipers be damned, to reach the supply containers. They tore through the rigging with knives and bare hands, shouting discoveries like prospectors striking gold. Belted 50 cal, cases of it. Bazooka rockets, Christ, we got rockets! Medical supplies, plasma, morphine. Artillery crews descended on pallets of 105mm shells with religious fervor. For days they'd been limited to 5 rounds per gun per day, watching German armor maneuver freely because they couldn't afford to shoot. Now, wooden crates stamped high explosive thudded to earth by the dozens. Loaders began stacking shells beside their guns with trembling hands, already calculating fire missions, already planning retribution. At the aid stations, the transformation was immediate. Captain Jack Pryor caught a bundle of medical supplies mid-bounce, tearing it open to find what he'd been praying for. Plasma bottles, sulfa powder, sterile bandages, morphine syrettes arranged in neat rows like answered prayers. His surgical staff gathered around, touching the supplies as if they might vanish. "We can operate properly now," a nurse whispered, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. "We can actually save them." Within minutes, medics were moving through the aid station with fresh supplies, finally able to treat the wounded with more than improvised bandages and whispered comfort. Men who'd been biting leather straps during amputations received morphine. Soldiers with infected wounds got sulfa. The plasma went immediately to cases of traumatic blood loss. Lives that would have been lost an hour earlier were now being saved in real time. Food bundles sparked near chaos. K rations, C rations, coffee, sugar, even, impossibly, canned turkey for Christmas dinner. Paratroopers who'd been splitting single rations between 3 men now had actual meals. Some ate immediately, wolfing down food with the desperation of the truly starving. Others carefully pocketed rations for later, instincts honed by scarcity, not yet believing the abundance was real. Private Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry later wrote, "I opened a can of ham and eggs and ate it cold, right there in the snow, and it was the finest meal I'd ever tasted. Men around me were crying while they ate. Not from joy, from relief that we might actually live." But the supply drop wasn't just material salvation. It was psychological resurrection. Every parachute that landed said, "You are not abandoned. You are not forgotten. The full weight of American industrial power is behind you." The mathematics of the siege had just been recalculated. German commanders had bet on attrition, starvation, cold, and isolation breaking the 101st's will. They'd watched the fog ground Allied air power and believed weather had handed them victory. Instead, they watched 241 aircraft casually resupply an entire division in a single afternoon, a logistical feat the Luftwaffe couldn't have matched at the height of its power. The wolves were still circling, but the prey had just grown fangs. Oberst Heinz Kokott, commander of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, stood at his command post east of Bastogne and watched his certainty of victory dissolve into the winter sky. For 6 days he'd reported to his superiors that the Americans were weakening, that their ammunition was nearly exhausted, that hunger and cold were doing the Wehrmacht's work. His intelligence officers had intercepted radio traffic confirming desperate supply shortages. His forward observers had counted the diminishing American artillery responses. The mathematics were simple. Bastogne would fall within 48 hours, perhaps sooner. Then the sky opened, and the mathematics became irrelevant. "Mein Gott," his operations officer whispered, binoculars pressed to his face. "How many aircraft is that?" Kokot didn't answer. He was counting, trying to count, but the formations kept coming. Dozens became scores, became hundreds. C-47s flying in perfect parade formation at suicidal altitude. Fighter escorts swarming like angry hornets. Parachutes blossoming until the sky looked like a garden blooming in mid-air. This wasn't a desperate resupply attempt. This was a demonstration. A Hauptmann from the divisional staff approached, his face pale. "Herr Oberst, intelligence estimates 241 aircraft. Perhaps more." Kokot lowered his field glasses slowly. 241 aircraft. For one town. For one encircled division. Dispatched as casually as if the Americans were simply restocking a warehouse rather than resupplying a besieged garrison through active combat operations. "The entire Luftwaffe," he said quietly, "hasn't flown a mission this large since Stalingrad." The comparison hung in the air like an accusation. Everyone present knew what had happened at Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe's catastrophic failure to resupply Paulus's trapped Sixth Army. The slow starvation of 300,000 German soldiers, while Hermann Göring's promises of airlift proved hollow. That disaster had required everything German air power could muster, and it had failed spectacularly. The Americans were accomplishing in a single afternoon what the Reich could no longer achieve in months. At a Luftwaffe observation post north of the town, Oberleutnant Werner Kleist watched through a rangefinder designed for directing anti-aircraft fire. His flak batteries were shooting. He could see the tracers arcing upward, but the American formations barely wavered. For every C-47 that took damage, 10 more completed their drops untouched. The fighter escorts were systematically destroying every gun position that revealed itself. His radio operator called out intercepts. American fighters requesting target coordinates. American transports reporting successful drops. American command confirming resupply complete in Sector 4. The clinical efficiency of their communications was somehow worse than the aircraft themselves. No panic, no heroic desperation. Just professional pilots executing a complex operation as if it were routine training. Kleist set down his rangefinder and turned to his sergeant, his voice hollow. "Their army falls from the sky," he said, "and we cannot stop it." The sergeant said nothing. What was there to say? They were witnessing industrial supremacy manifest in physical form, watching an empire demonstrate capabilities that rendered courage, tactics, and determination merely footnotes to material superiority. Across the German siege lines, the realization spread like winter cold seeping through a coat. Officers revised their reports. Enlisted men stared at the parachutes littering the landscape inside Bastogne's perimeter. Radio operators transmitted increasingly desperate requests for reinforcements, for air support, for anything that might counter what they'd just witnessed. But everyone knew the truth now. The siege hadn't failed because of American courage or defensive genius. It had failed because Germany was fighting an enemy that could resupply an entire division as effortlessly as breathing. The 101st wasn't trapped in Bastogne. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division was trapped outside it, besieging a fortress that would never run out of ammunition, never starve, never surrender. And Patton's Third Army was coming. December 24, 1944. 0600 hours. The German attack came at dawn. 3 battalions from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division supported by armor, probing the western perimeter where intelligence suggested American defenses were weakest. It was a standard assault, the kind that had worked against exhausted, undersupplied defenders for 6 days. This time was different. The response was immediate and devastating. American artillery, silent for days except for carefully rationed shots, erupted with sudden fury. The 463rd and 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalions had spent the night distributing the shells from yesterday's resupply drop. Now they unleashed calculated vengeance. Fire missions that had been delayed for days due to ammunition shortages were executed with precision. German infantry advancing across open ground walked into a storm of high explosive that shredded their formations before they reached the American foxholes. Battery Commander Major Stuart Seaton later recalled, "We'd been keeping lists, every target we'd wanted to hit but couldn't afford to shoot at. That morning, we worked through the entire list. It felt like Christmas morning." Machine gun positions that had been conserving ammunition now fired in sustained bursts. Browning 50 caliber guns hammered German armor from concealed positions, their crews no longer worried about running dry. Riflemen engaged at distances they'd previously avoided, knowing resupply was no longer a fantasy but a demonstrated reality. The German assault broke apart within 40 minutes. Survivors retreated under covering fire that was itself cut to pieces by American artillery. Bodies lay frozen in the snow where confident Wehrmacht soldiers had expected to overrun a starving, exhausted garrison. Instead, they'd found the Screaming Eagles reborn. By midday, the transformation was complete. P-47 Thunderbolts that had escorted yesterday's resupply mission returned with a new mission: close air support. Fighter bombers circled over Bastogne like guardian angels, waiting for ground controllers to direct them toward targets. When German armor attempted to reposition near Flamièrge, the P-47s descended with rockets and 50 caliber fire. Panzer IV's and Stu-J3 assault guns, previously able to maneuver freely during the fog-bound siege, now burned under repeated strafing runs. Tank commanders who'd grown comfortable operating near Bastogne suddenly found themselves hunted from above by aircraft that could see everything and strike with impunity. Lieutenant Colonel Crouch's fighter squadron flew mission after mission, targeting German supply columns, command posts, and artillery positions. Each pass broadcast the same message: the sky belongs to us, the ground belongs to the 101st. You have nowhere to hide. German radio intercepts revealed growing desperation. Units requesting permission to withdraw. Commanders reporting unsustainable casualties. Logistics officers unable to move supplies forward under constant air attack. Inside Bastogne's perimeter, morale soared to levels that seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Paratroopers who'd been sharing frozen K rations now ate hot meals. Wounded soldiers received proper medical care. Artillery crews fired with the confidence of men who knew more shells were coming. The fog had lifted. The supplies had arrived. The Air Force owned the sky. And the 101st Airborne, hungry, frostbitten, outnumbered, and surrounded, had transformed from desperate defenders into an unbreakable anvil upon which German attacks shattered. Oberst Kokot reported to his superiors that evening, "Continued assault on Bastogne inadvisable without significant reinforcement and air support. American defensive capability has been completely restored. Recommend consolidating positions and awaiting further orders." The recommendation was rejected, but everyone reading it understood what it really meant. The siege had failed. December 22, 1944. Arlon, Luxembourg, 90 kilometers south of Bastogne. While the 101st Airborne endured its darkest hours under fog and siege, Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr. was orchestrating one of the most remarkable pivots in military history. His Third Army, engaged in offensive operations along the Saar River, received orders to disengage, rotate 90 degrees north, and relieve Bastogne within 48 hours. It meant wheeling 3 entire divisions through winter conditions, across demolished roads, through German-held territory, while maintaining combat effectiveness. Military theorists considered such a maneuver impossible. Logistics officers called it suicide. Patton called it an opportunity to make the bastards pay. By December 23rd, the same day 241 aircraft resupplied Bastogne, Patton's spearhead was already punching north. The 4th Armored Division led the advance, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, with orders as simple as they were brutal. Reach Bastogne at any cost. Combat Command A and Combat Command B split into parallel columns, Sherman tanks grinding through snow and mud, crushing roadblocks, smashing through German delaying positions. Behind them came the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions, securing the flanks and clearing bypassed enemy strongpoints. The weather that had nearly killed the 101st now aided Patton's advance. The same clear skies that allowed the airlift also gave American fighter bombers free rein over German positions. P-47 ranged ahead of the armored columns, destroying bridges the Germans needed for reinforcement, cratering roads they needed for retreat, hunting any vehicle that moved. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, led the spearhead with characteristic aggression. His Shermans hit German roadblocks, bypassed when possible, blasted through when necessary. When enemy armor appeared, Abrams pushed forward rather than deploying into defensive positions. Speed was survival. Hesitation was death. German commanders watching the American advance felt the strategic situation deteriorating in real time. Reports flooded into Wehrmacht headquarters. American armor advancing from the south. American resupply operations successful over Bastogne. American air superiority absolute. The 101st showing no signs of collapse. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzerlehr Division, sent increasingly desperate messages to higher command. His division, already weakened by weeks of combat, was positioned directly in Patton's path. He requested reinforcements, air support, permission to withdraw to better defensive positions. All requests were denied. Hold at all costs, came the reply. Bastogne must fall before American relief arrives. But the mathematics had shifted irrevocably. The airlift of December 23rd hadn't just resupplied the 101st. It had bought them the time they needed. Every hour Patton's columns pushed north. The German siege around Bastogne became more untenable. Every successful supply drop made the besieged garrison stronger, while the besiegers grew weaker. By December 25th, advance elements of the 4th Armored Division were within 10 kilometers of Bastogne, fighting through determined German resistance at Chaumont and Cibray. Radio contact was established between Patton's forces and the 101st's command post. Relief was no longer theoretical, it was imminent, measurable in hours rather than days. Inside Bastogne, the sound of approaching artillery could be heard from the south. Not German guns pounding the perimeter, but American guns, Patton's guns, systematically destroying anything between 3rd Army and the besieged town. A paratrooper listening to the distant thunder turned to his squad leader with a grim smile. Sounds like old blood and guts finally showed up to the party. The noose around Bastogne wasn't tightening anymore. It was unraveling. December 26, 1944. 16:45 hours. Assenois, Belgium. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams stood in the turret of his command. Sherman studying the village ahead through binoculars. Assenois, a collection of stone houses and farm buildings, sat astride the last major road between his 37th Tank Battalion and Bastogne, just 5 kilometers to the north. Intelligence reported the village was heavily defended. German infantry, anti-tank guns, possibly armor. A conventional attack would take hours, maybe days. Men would die clearing each building, each hedgerow, each kilometer. Abrams made his decision in seconds. We're going straight through. Maximum speed. Don't stop for anything. His staff officers stared at him. Drive through a fortified village without infantry support, without reconnaissance, without artillery preparation. It violated every doctrine in the manual. Abrams didn't care about doctrine. He cared about the 101st Airborne freezing in foxholes 5 kilometers away. And he cared about hitting the Germans so fast and so hard they wouldn't have time to organize a defense. At 1650 hours, the assault began. Led Sherman, C Company, 37th Tank Battalion. Call sign Cobra King. Commander, First Lieutenant Charles P. Bogus. Crew, 4 men who understood they were about to make history or die trying. Cobra King hit Bastogne at 35 miles per hour with guns blazing. 75mm main gun firing high explosive. 30 caliber coaxial machine gun hammering. 50 caliber turret gun raking every window and doorway. Behind it, the entire column followed in thunderous formation. Shermans, half-tracks packed with infantry, tank destroyers, all pouring fire into the village as they roared through. German defenders, expecting a cautious approach, found themselves facing an American armored column that refused to slow down. Anti-tank guns got off single shots before being crushed under Sherman treads, or obliterated by return fire. Infantry positions were overrun before soldiers could reload. The sheer audacity of the attack created its own momentum. Cobra King emerged from Bastogne's northern edge with its armor scarred but intact. Bogus oriented on Bastogne and pushed his throttle forward. The road ahead was open, miraculously, impossibly open. Behind him, the rest of C Company followed, leaving Bastogne burning in their wake. At 1645 hours, First Lieutenant Bogus spotted foxholes ahead. American foxholes. Paratroopers emerging from positions, staring at the approaching Shermans with expressions caught between disbelief and joy. Bogus keyed his radio. "This is Cobra King. Come here." "This is the 4th Armored." A paratrooper, accounts vary whether it was from the 326th Airborne Engineers or 101st Headquarters staff, approached cautiously, as if the tank might be a mirage. He reached out and touched Cobra King's cold armor plating, then looked up at Bogus with tears streaming down his face. "You made it! Jesus Christ! You actually made it!" The siege of Bastogne was officially broken. Within hours, supply convoys were rolling into town. Wounded soldiers were evacuated. Fresh troops rotated into defensive positions. Hot food, ammunition, medical supplies, everything the airlift had begun was now sustained by ground resupply through Patton's corridor. That evening, General McAuliffe shook hands with officers from the 4th Armored Division in Bastogne's battered command post. The 101st had held for 7 days against impossible odds. The airlift had saved them from collapse. Patton's Third Army had shattered the siege. But everyone present understood what the breakthrough really represented. The moment Hitler's last gamble definitively failed. The Germans could no longer isolate Bastogne. They could no longer threaten Antwerp. The Ardennes offensive, launched with such confidence just 10 days earlier, had broken against American resilience, American logistics, and American air power. Oberst Cocotte received orders to withdraw his battered 26th Volksgrenadier Division that night. As his soldiers pulled back through the snow, they could see supply trucks streaming into Bastogne, American flags flying over positions they'd been assured would surrender. The wolves had retreated. The screaming eagles remain. Nuremberg, Germany, 1946, War Crimes Tribunal interviews. Oberst Heinz Cocotte sat across from American interrogators, no longer commanding divisions, but answering questions about decisions made in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. When asked about the failure to capture Bastogne, his response was immediate and unflinching. "We did not lose to the 101st Airborne," he said quietly. "We lost to your Air Force. On December 23rd, when those 241 aircraft appeared over Bastogne, the siege ended. We simply didn't know it yet." The interrogator pressed him. Weren't German forces still numerically superior? Didn't they maintain the encirclement for 3 more days? Cocotte shook his head. "Numbers became meaningless the moment your supplies fell from the sky. We could surround 10 American divisions. It would not matter if you could resupply them at will. The Luftwaffe could not protect our columns, could not stop your fighters, could not match even 1/10 of what your Air Force accomplished over a single Belgian town in a single afternoon." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We learned at Bastogne what we should have understood much earlier. Germany was not fighting an army. We were fighting an industrial empire that could project power vertically, horizontally, in any direction it chose. You owned the sky, and whoever owns the sky owns the war." Post-war memoir, General der Panzertruppe. Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz. The American resupply operation of December 23rd was the most demoralizing event my troops witnessed during the entire Ardennes offensive. We had assured them the enemy was trapped, starving, on the verge of collapse. Then the clouds opened, and their entire Air Force appeared. My soldiers understood in that moment that we could never win, not because we lacked courage, but because we lacked the industrial capacity to fight an enemy who controlled the third dimension of warfare so completely. Bastogne, Belgium. 1945, present. The town rebuilt itself around the memory of those 7 days. The square where McAuliffe's command post stood. The fields where colored parachutes fell like salvation. The roads where Cobra King broke through. Monuments rose to commemorate not just the soldiers who held the line, but the air crews who risked everything flying through flak at 400 feet. Plaques honor the C-47 pilots who kept formation while their aircraft shuddered under anti-aircraft fire. Memorials recognize the P-47 pilots who dove again and again to protect the transports. The Mardassen Memorial, a star-shaped structure overlooking Bastogne, bears the names of 76,890 American soldiers who fought in the Ardennes. At its center, an inscription captures what the battle represented. The Belgian people, grateful to their American liberators, recall the sacrifices of the soldiers of the United States of America. But Bastogne became more than memory. It became symbol of what happens when courage meets logistics. When airmen and ground forces coordinate with precision. When an industrial democracy decides that a single surrounded town matters enough to marshal every available resource for its salvation. The 101st Airborne's courage was undeniable. They held against overwhelming odds, refused surrender, fought through cold and hunger and constant bombardment, but courage alone would not have saved them. They survived because 241 aircraft proved that American air power could accomplish in one afternoon what the entire Luftwaffe could no longer achieve in months. They survived because supply sergeants loaded parachutes through the night, because pilots flew through flak that should have killed them, because fighter escorts dove into anti-aircraft fire to protect transports, because an entire logistical infrastructure stretching from England to France to Belgium functioned with industrial precision under impossible conditions. December 23rd remains the date Bastogne remembers most. Not December 26th, when Patton broke through. Not December 22nd, when McAuliffe said nuts. But December 23rd, the day the fog lifted and the sky opened, and 241 American aircraft demonstrated that the siege had already been lost before it began. The day the sky chose its side. The day Bastogne was reborn.